It's great that you could be here today. We have basically everyone is here in this room, but we have the wonderful Professor Rachel Taylor at in Dunedin in New Zealand, who will be talking with us. For those who don't know me, my name is Louise Bauer. I'm the Professor of Child and Adolescent Health at the University of Sydney. I'm most of the time I'm based at the Kids Hospital Westmead, but for 20% of my time, normally on Wednesdays, I'm here at the Charles Perkins Centre. I'm also the director of the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood Centre of Research Excellence. And it's in that context that I'm introducing this talk. As I start, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that this particular campus of the University of Sydney, the Camperdown campus, is built, but there are many other campuses, some of them fantastic. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship country. Now, let's go here. So let me start. We're talking about children are our future, talking sleep and modelling and childhood overweight and obesity. I'll just tell you briefly about the Centre of Research Excellence, or CRE. And here is a photograph taken earlier this year of some disreputable people who are part of this group. Some of you may know them, and actually for information, Rachel and Alison are down here and I'm further up the stair. So why are we interested in childhood obesity prevention? Well, globally, it's prevalent and it has become more prevalent. Here's a schema showing prevalence of overweight and obesity in children aged 2 to 4 years. You can see at the top, 1980, down the bottom, 2018. This is actually obesity prevalence, and the hotter the colour, the redder it is, the higher the prevalence. And you can see that over that 35-year period, more and more young children are affected by obesity around the world in terms of high BMI. Within Australia, we also know that it's prevalent. In fact, if in the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report from 2017 to 2018, the prevalence of combined overweight or obesity was essentially the same at school entry, age 4 or 5, as it was in adolescence, getting higher thereafter, and just highlights that this is an issue that's already well established by the time school comes along. School age can't be the place where all the interventions occur. We know that, as I've just said, the obesity prevalence in under 5s has increased. There are higher rates, I haven't shown you this, amongst those who are Indigenous, culturally diverse or experiencing social disadvantage, and that's around the world, including in New Zealand. And obesity-related behaviours, poor diet quality, decreased physical activity, increased sedentary behaviours and decreased sleep duration are established early in life, and they track. So it's not only all over Red Rover by the time you turn 18, it may be all over Red Rover maybe by the time you turn 5, or is it? We'll think about that. The NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood was established in 2016 and has been funded since then, 2 tranches of NHMRC funding. And our current aims are to identify and translate the most effective, cost-effective, scalable and sustainable approaches to prevent obesity and reduce obesity-related behaviours in children aged 0 to 5 years. We're nothing if not big focused. Now, of course, many of us, including Rachel and Alison and myself, aren't just confined to the 0 to 5-year-old age group. And Alison will be talking about slightly older kids as well. And both Alison and I have a great interest in other age groups as well. I'm the director, but we have people, 20 CIs and AIs from 3 states, from New Zealand, from Ireland, and we have many early and mid-career researchers, and they're growing. We have a stream of work looking at effective interventions and monitoring. We have one looking at resource allocation, Alison co-leads that, and one on implementation and scale-up. The aim is improved child health. So that's our CRE, Please find out more about us if you wish. We have a great community of practice for people interested in research and prevention of obesity in early childhood, healthy infant feeding, young child growth, etc., etc. If you're one of those people, early and mid-career researchers, PhD students, think about finding out about EPOC Connect and come to our free regular online meetings. We've had a range of funding from a range of different sources because we've picked up on this, and it's a truly wonderful collaboration of people, only some of whom are shown in that photograph. But more importantly, I want you to hear from two of our wonderful chief investigators over that period of time. And the first person I'm going to introduce is Professor Rachel Taylor, who will be speaking, who's actually lurking there, coming to speak to us. So as I bring up the information about her, so what's the best way? As I talk about you, Rachel, it may be best for you to share your screen while I introduce you. So if you go to here. So I'll just tell you about Rachel. Professor Rachel Taylor is the Karatani Fellow in Early Childhood Obesity. She's also head of the Department of Medicine and director of the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre, one of the University of Otago's flagship research centres. Point out that she's a very strong nutrition researcher, and she's the first head of medicine they've had who's not actually a medical practitioner. Rachel is also a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Rachel is interested in determining how sleep, diet, and physical activity can be manipulated to favourably affect body weight throughout the life cycle, but particularly in childhood. Her work consists of observational studies and randomised controlled trials. And today, Rachel will talk to us about her research exploring the links between sleep and weight status in children. Thank you, Rachel. Great to have you speak with us.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Louise, for a very kind introduction. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about sleep. And when we think of weight management, be it in adults or children, what we tend to think of, what first comes to mind is really what we eat and how we exercise. And what doesn't really feature in most people's thoughts is actually how well you sleep. And yet the observational evidence is incredibly strong, particularly in children, showing that if they don't sleep long enough, they do have an increased risk of obesity. The data are there in adults as well, but it's not quite as strong as what we see for children. And I would argue much stronger than the observational evidence linking fruit or vegetable intake or even diet, physical activity, for instance, to body weight in children. But when we have behaviours like this, we need to be able to intervene on them to make a difference, because if any behaviour can't be changed, then it's not really very useful to us in the obesity sort of sphere. So a number of years ago now, we started our POI, our Prevention of Overweight and Infancy intervention, where we managed to convince 800 pregnant women in Dunedin to either come into a 2-year sort of food and activity intervention or a more novel sleep intervention. You'll see the FAB intervention there was quite involved, had about 8 contacts. It promoted breastfeeding, healthy eating, and physical activity. Our sleep intervention was actually very, very brief. We got the women in the latter stages of their pregnancy to come in, and we had a bit of a chat to them, and then we went into the homes when the infants were just 3 weeks of age and sort of talked about sleep and how it was going. Somewhat to our immense surprise, at the end of the 2-year intervention, we saw quite a difference in the prevalence of obesity in children who had received sleep intervention of about 10% and about 18% in the children who had not received a sleep intervention. So the relative risk had essentially about halved at the end of that intervention. Now, as many of you will know, many obesity interventions, prevention interventions, don't have much success at the end of the intervention. And what really flabbergasted us in a lot of ways is when we did a 3-year follow-up at the age of 5, that benefit was still there. So huge potential maybe for a very brief sleep intervention to have some benefit. Have other studies supported our POI fundings? Unfortunately, there's been very little research in the obesity prevention space that's actually included sleep. No other studies have isolated and looked at sleep alone, but we do have some wonderful research both locally in terms of your CHAT study run out of Sydney University there, and Insight, which is an American study which has added sleep to their dietary and physical activity components and seen benefits for early obesity prevention. And the wonderful Top Child intervention collaboration, which is also part of Sydney University, there's quite a few more studies coming through that are looking at sleep. So I hope we'll have a much better answer in the future about how valuable sleep can be as an intervention initiative. So how does sleeping more, which after all is the ultimate sedentary activity, actually reduce our risk of obesity? Essentially, we need experimental evidence to actually give us this information. So the only way of really showing this is to make children sleep deprived and see what it does to their diet and exercise. So Dunedin populations, as you might imagine, are very amenable to research. So here we managed to convince 100 families with children who were good sleepers to undergo 1 week of sleep restriction. So for 1 week, they went to bed 1 hour later than they normally did. And then in another week, 1 hour earlier, because we were trying to create an up to 2 hour difference in sleep. The kids had to get up at the same time each morning. And so what we were trying to answer, this was not an RCT to look at sleep as a weight loss intervention or anything like that. This was a mechanistic study trying to determine, was it changes to diet or changes to physical activity that actually might be responsible for the link between sleep and weight? So for instance, you may feel yourself, if you're a bit tired, you perhaps are less inclined to do some physical activity. It could be as simple as if you are awake longer at night, you've got more time to go to the fridge. So what we were able to show in this experiment was that children on average lost about 48 minutes of sleep a night over the course of that 1 week period. However, as often happens when your sleep is not as long, it becomes more consolidated. So they actually woke up less in the night as well. So they were saving about 56 minutes a night. Now, of course, time occurs in a fixed 24-hour window. As much as we'd want to, we cannot add or subtract time. So if you spend less time asleep, you've got to spend more time doing something else. So to many people's surprise, our children were not less active when they were sleep deprived. They were actually more active. So most of that time was spent sedentary, but they actually also increased their amount of light physical activity. No change on their moderate to vigorous physical activity. So it doesn't seem to be the physical activity side of the energy balance equation. What some colleagues of ours have done in the States was actually look at the sort of patterns of activity over the time. And what this is showing you is there's no magic redistribution of that time. It's just showing you that if you go to bed later, you've got more time to be sedentary and more time to do some light physical activity. It's as simple as that. What it does change, however, is what children eat, and to a very substantial degree. And so these numbers on the end here refer to the difference in energy intake and the sleep restriction versus the sleep extension condition. So you can see that most of those don't quite reach statistical significance, with exception of non-core foods. So when they were tired, kids ate about 400 kilojoules more each day from non-core foods. If you restrict that to our protocol sample, so these were a priori, got at least 30 minutes less sleep in the restriction condition. It actually ended up sort of about 65 minutes on average. You can see that most of these are now significant. They're eating more energy, and it's all crappy foods, effectively, and sugary drinks. It ain't the good stuff. So how much is 400 to 500 kilojoules per day? A couple of ginger nuts, most of a can of Coke, or a lot of carrots. But as you saw, this was not the food of choice when children were tired. So that doesn't seem like a lot of energy, but actually an energy gap, so that's the difference in energy required from current weight to gain weight, of just 200 to 300 kilojoules a day is enough to explain how young children who are normal weight can become overweight only over a few short years. So those changes we saw in that experimental study could easily explain the link between sleep and obesity that we see in children. Why do they change what they eat? And so we also did quite a few measurements in this capacity. And we did these interesting exploratory analyses. Now, I know this looks slightly complicated, but I'll explain to you. The top two show that it was only children who were overweight who showed a difference in a couple of key eating behaviours. So children who were overweight were less satiety responsiveness or less able to eat in response to hunger when they were tired. They also showed a decrease in their slowness in eating score. So in other words, they ate faster. And speed of eating and satiety responsiveness have both been associated with weight in children. By contrast, children who were normal weight ate less in response to their emotions when they were tired and got fussier over food. So these were very much exploratory analyses, but they do provide some interesting insight into why perhaps there might be a difference across different children of different weight groups. I think one of the most interesting things we saw in this study was that we also measured health-related quality of life. And we were able to show that after just 1 week of about 40 minutes, each of the analyses has a slightly different mean sleep time, as you might imagine, had significant reductions in their physical, school, and total well-being after just 1 week of not sleeping as well. This was really clear from both the kids and the parents. You know, anecdotally, they told us, some of them, they just couldn't believe how such a small difference in sleep had made such a dramatic difference to how their kids were functioning, and indeed how their parents were functioning and how they were parenting their children. So what can we actually do then about sleep? How could we potentially improve sleep in children? And one of the things that really first comes to mind, of course, is our use of screens. So there is quite a lot of observational literature which would suggest at this point that using screens, any sort of digital media before bed, is not terribly good for your sleep. But the evidence is weak, is essentially very weak. Most of them only ask sort of about total screen time, or they might try and ask about a few devices. But essentially assessing screen time is much more complicated than it used to be. Gone are the days when there was a single device in the house, when that device only had certain children's programming hours, or in my time, Ready to Roll was the pop charts on at 6 o'clock, which also happened to be on at the same time as the news. So, of course, you were never allowed to watch Ready to Roll because Dad was always watching the news. This is how children use their screens now. It's rapid, it moves fast, it often involves more than one screen, both with audio playing, and they're switching from activity to activity. How on earth can questionnaires actually measure screen time if that's really how children are using their screens? So this is what we did in our bed study. Excuse me. We actually put police body cameras on the kids. So they wore these police body cameras that collected video and audio on a harness that was worn around the chest from 2 or 3 hours before bed until they got into bed. And so this is the sort of picture that you'd get from the video, and like what you've just seen in the previous slide. So you can see you get a really good picture of the devices the children are using. You clearly get a really good idea of the duration of each activity because all those videos are time-stamped. And depending on your methods of interest, you might be interested in knowing what particular app or program that they're actually on. Because we were really interested in how screens affect sleep per se, we also, though, wanted to collect data overnight. So as well, the kids had a second body camera in their rooms overnight that was supposed to start collecting data from sort of just before they went to sleep until after they went to sleep. It had infrared, and so it was able to collect video even in the dark. Because we were quite interested in the sneaky screen use idea. So this little fella here, it's clearly lights out. He's got a hair out for mum.
Oh, the dog too.
You can hear mum coming. And there's definitely not on his device before he then goes back to it. So we were really intrigued with how much of this is actually happening. And again, would questionnaires ever actually obtain that information? So I had two fantastic PhD students, Brad and Shay. Nobody's actually ever done this before. So nobody's used video cameras to collect screen time information. So this was pretty new stuff. So while that makes it exciting, it makes it incredibly difficult because somehow we had to work out how to code 4,000 hours of video data to measure screen time in this group of kids. And what they were able to show through undertaking a whole number of pilot studies was that, as well as being able to tell what device the kids were using, they could tell whether a kid was on social media, whether they were browsing the internet, messaging their friends, and so on, whether or not they were actually able to see the screen that the child was actually using. And that became apparent really because of the sort of finger movements, essentially, the way kids interacted with their devices in terms of scrolling versus tapping made it quite easy to actually determine what the kids were doing. And we were able to do that by having cameras sort of both on the side and on the front, coding the side camera first where you couldn't see the screen and using the front camera as the gold standard. So what are some other ways of potentially improving sleep in youth? One of the newer areas we're just getting into now is what happens if we could actually delay the time at which our teenagers, just our older teenagers, actually start school. Because Mother Nature, for some bizarre reason, made it so that the biological need for children, older teenagers, to go to sleep at a time that we think is appropriate has changed. I mean, older teenagers have a real mismatch between when they would like to go to sleep and when they're sort of told to go to sleep. And so the equivalent is said to be asking your teenager to get up at 7 a.m. is like asking an adult to wake up at 4 a.m. And I don't think any of us could grab our uniform, be pleasant, have a shower, make our lunch, all those sorts of things at 4 o'clock, 5 days a week. So there's lots of potential benefits for this, so not only on sleep, mental health, academic outcomes. One of the really interesting bits of data overseas has been all about traffic accidents, and data from America has shown that there's a substantial reduction in traffic accidents from children who undergo a delayed sleep intervention because, of course, they're less sleepy in the morning. This has perhaps been one of the single positives of the COVID epidemic, and that's because through a natural experiment, many of our schools actually changed the time at which they started. So these are actually data from Europe, and they're at the more extreme end, but they show the difference in sleep from children who attended a morning school versus an afternoon school. You can see it's about 2 hours a day. That has got to have a benefit for their sleep and well-being. One of the single biggest sort of questions that comes up is if you delay children's school start time, won't they just go to bed later? But actually they don't, because there's that innate drive. They might go to bed a little bit later, but the entire difference almost is due to the ability to sleep in and to get up later. So, sorry, just having a wee freeze there. A Cochrane review in 2017 thought that there was limited or mixed evidence for many of these things, but the main issue, including weight, so there's very little evidence at the moment for the effect of weight on this initiative, but the quality of evidence is pretty poor, and more recently some better evidence is actually coming out. The vast majority of that evidence has also been undertaken in the States, where school start times are hugely earlier than they are, certainly in New Zealand, and I think to a fair way in Australia as well. So I think it's something like 3/4 of schools start before 8 a.m, and a good hunk, about a third of them, start before 7:30 a.m. What we would argue here is that even an 8:30 a.m. or even a 9 a.m. start is actually too late as well, because we still have a real problem with mental health in New Zealand, and I'm sure yours is the same in Australia, and we still have more than half of our teenagers who aren't getting enough sleep. So what we'd like to look at is whether we should be shifting to something like a 10 or 11 a.m. start. And this lovely natural experiment in the UK, they had a school district that changed from an 8:50 start to a 10 a.m. start and saw wonderful reductions in absences due to illness from children and increases in their educational performance. As happens with schools, there was a new school board, flagged it, reverted to their 8:50 start, and we can see the opposite trends happening. So that's what we're up to in the next couple of years here. We're going to convince 6 high schools to have a delayed school start. So we're currently undertaking quite a lot of that background work now in terms of how on earth can we convince kids, that part's easy, parents, schools, other stakeholders, employers, etc., to actually participate in these sorts of things, because I think the potential benefits for teenagers are massive. So is sleep the answer? It's not the answer. But it certainly should be part of the obesity puzzle that it's not currently. We know lots of children aren't receiving enough. We know parents are very receptive to intervention, and that is a very different situation from dietary intervention. And I just think there's huge potential for sleep to be a lot more involved. I'd just like to thank all my wonderful colleagues and our funders. Thanks so much.
Wow, Rachel, that was amazing. And I'm sure we could speak with you for hours about that is, and I hope to have that opportunity soon. But we will move on to our next speaker now. And we'll just share the screen so we can go back to this while I explain. Isn't that an amazing overview of incredible work that Rachel does and has been doing for many years? Rachel is part of our early prevention of obesity in childhood CRE. And another person is Associate Professor Alison Hayes. So Alison is the Professor in Health Economics at the Sydney School of Public Health, and she specialises in health economic modelling of chronic disease. Her work takes a life course approach in projecting the consequences of chronic disease with a strong emphasis on modelling the epidemiology of disease and its associated long-term costs and quality of life outcomes. The models combine techniques of patient-level simulation with decision analysis for evaluating the cost-effectiveness of interventions. Alison is passionate about using models as translational tools to bridge the gap between cost-effectiveness into evidence and policy decisions in public health. Alison is another core member of our Centre of Research Excellence, and today she will talk to us about the health economic modelling implications of child growth from early life. Thank you, Alison. Did you want to change this?
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. Thanks everybody for coming. Spoiler alert, this is going to be nowhere near as exciting as Rachel's talk, but you know, I'm a health economist, so there we go. So when we're talking about health economic modelling of child growth, we're really talking about health economic evaluation. So I'm going to spend like just 2 minutes just giving you like a 2-minute kind of introduction to health economics, just to bring you all up to the same level, because we use a lot of acronyms, let's be honest. So why do we do health economic modelling? Well, policymakers need good economic data to underpin their decisions to invest in interventions. And as health economists, we would say it's not enough for an intervention to be effective. It also has to be cost effective. Because we're usually working within resource constraints. We can't deliver every intervention possible. We have to deliver those that give us the best bang for the buck. And particularly in prevention, it's very unusual to have long-term evidence that a program or an intervention works. And we really want to look or be able to evaluate future costs and benefits. This is particularly important in prevention, where we know that perhaps the future costs and benefits are going to be many, many years in the future. And so the whole idea of economic evaluation in modelling is that we can actually work out what are the best buys in the fight against early childhood obesity. So, for instance, the questions that might be is, should we fund programs in preschool? Should we fund programs in early childhood? Should we fund both? Should we put our funds to later in childhood, potentially? And when we talk about cost effectiveness, sometimes people think we're talking about saving money, like something that actually saves money in the long term. It's not quite the same as, we hope that we do save some money, but cost effectiveness is all about value for money. So the extra money that you have to spend, let's say on an intervention, hopefully will save some money further down the track and will have some health benefits. And what we're looking at doing is maximizing benefits, health benefits at a minimum cost. And here's where the acronyms come in, sorry. The measure of cost effectiveness is an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which we refer to as an ISA. And it's actually very simple. All it is the difference in the total cost of a new intervention and the existing intervention or usual care or the comparator divided by the difference in the health outcomes. And so what this means is it's like a measure of the extra cost that you have to spend to get that extra unit of benefit. Now, two more things down the bottom there. CEA means cost effectiveness analysis. So an example might be $1,200 per 0.1 BMI-Z unit avoided. And that's a natural outcome. It's very hard to compare that against anything other than another study that also had BMI-Z as the outcome. The sort of gold standard really in health economic evaluation is to do cost utility analysis, in which we will be looking at incremental cost per QALY gained. Here's another phrase. The good thing about QALYs, and I will say that, you know, the pharmaceutical budget is allocated based on cost per QALYs. The good thing about QALYs is you can actually compare something, you know, in early childhood obesity prevention to something, you know, in stroke prevention in later life, for instance, because you've got this common unit of outcome. So what is a QALY? And this is the last kind of introductory site on health economics. So the idea is that quality adjusted life years measures both length of life and the quality of that life. So there's a weighting for life years from 0 to 1. So let's say we have someone with limited mobility. The quality of life weight might be 0.5, or we call that a utility. For someone in full health, it might be 1. If they both live for 10 years, the person with limited mobility has gained 5 QALYs, and the person in full health has gained 10 QALYs. So that's how we work out QALYs. And the whole idea with cost effectiveness of early interventions, that if we can achieve healthy weight, we can maximize quality of life, and we can hopefully save on some healthcare costs. And that means that in modeling growth and in trying to model the effectiveness of early interventions, there's 3 things that we need. One is a model for growth or BMI trajectories. The other is how that relates to quality of life. And the other is how that might relate to healthcare costs. So the growth modeling during the 2 CREs. So the first thing here is modeling growth, and that's modeling BMI trajectories. Very fortunately, we have amazing data here in Australia because we have the longitudinal study of Australian children, which informed pretty much all of our work. And when we started, we only had 5 waves of data available. I think there are now actually 9 waves of data available, but that means with the 2 different cohorts, with data collection every 2 years, we actually had a period of time from kind of birth to 19 years. And the other great thing for us is that they have a bit objectively measured weight and height, which we could convert to BMI-Z, the WHO standard. And they also have measures of quality of life from individual children. Excuse me. So in terms of modeling BMI trajectories, what I'm showing here is just like a BMI trajectories for boys and girls. It's just mean BMI trajectories across the waves of data that we had at the beginning of the CRE, the beginning of this modeling study. And this is the predictions from our model when you just have the data from 4- and 5-year-olds. So the model actually is generating each, on an annual basis, generating BMI based on BMI growth at different ages. And you may think, well, this is very crude. Of course, this is just mean. This is just mean BMI. But we actually were able to model the different growth trajectories at different kind of starting BMI. So just as an example here, this is the growth trajectory for a child in healthy weight at age 4 or 5. And this is the growth trajectory for a girl in overweight, and this is for a child in an obese weight category. And you can see that if depending on your weight category, the growth trajectories are actually steeper. So steeper for overweight and steeper for being in an obese weight category. And we've used this in our modelling in order to be able to model not just the mean change in BMI across the child lifespan, but also the way that the distribution of BMI changes and lengthens. And this is kind of what it looks like, almost normal at age 5, and then you get this lengthening of the tail. And this enables us to actually capture weight status groups: underweight, healthy weight, overweight, and obesity within our modelling. So the next thing we needed to do was to actually look at quality of life in relation to weight status. So in the EPOC model, the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood model, we did a systematic review, or in fact, my colleague Vicky did a systematic review, Vicky Brown from Deakin, a systematic review and a meta-analysis for utility values to use in economic evaluation. And these are the values that we use. In terms of healthcare costs, again, we are using best evidence from the literature and kind of national level health expenditure statistics. So based on the study by Clifford, children with overweight had 12% higher costs than children with healthy weight, and children with obesity had 23% higher costs. And these kind of results are very, internationally, very based on a lot of information that, I mean, across lots and lots of different contexts, this is what you see in terms of overweight and obesity. It's kind of actually very similar in adults as well from a systematic review. And we used top-level data on hospital and ED expenditure and top-level data on Medicare costs and pharmaceutical costs to compute by each age group the costs for healthy weight, overweight, and obesity. So with the idea that if you can prevent overweight and obesity, you will save some healthcare costs. So this all goes into the model. We start the model with an input population of individual level data. So what I mean by that is like data for, it could be children from the longitudinal study. So that might be 10,000 children, it might be 5,000 children. And based on their age, sex, and BMI, we simulate a BMI trajectory. We track the quality of life and healthcare costs, and so we can look at both weight status and QALYs over time. And now I just want to go on to an example of using the model, and this was to look at the cost effectiveness of POI, the Prevention of Overweight in Infancy trial that Rachel was talking about. So this was a 4-arm trial. So there was the control arm, sleep, there was the food activity and breastfeeding arm, and a combination of FAB and sleep. We chose to evaluate just the sleep and the combination arm because these are the ones that had a significant reduction in child overweight and obesity at age 5. So the first thing to do when you're evaluating an intervention is to look at the intervention cost. This might include things like personnel time. In this particular case, it would have been nurse time, it would have been sleep specialist time, looking at transport, in other words, transport to go into people's homes, and then perhaps buildings and space to evaluate when there were kind of group meetings for some of these parts of the intervention. And the cost the per child cost of the intervention was $184 for sleep and $601 for the combination. And so at the end of so I'm just going to show you now the sleep compared to control in the interest of time. So at age 5, at the end of the trial, there was a very small difference in mean BMI, higher in the control than the sleep intervention. We then model over time, and you can see the 2 trajectories there. And then at age 15, that gave us again a change in BMI, or a difference in BMI between intervention and control, and a difference in obesity between the intervention and control. And these are the types of, this information can go into the calculation of the ISA if you wanted to have the calculation of the ISA as BMI units avoided. But what we would actually then tend to do is to use the weight status to generate information about QALYs. And when you bring all this together, I'm just showing you now the summary of the evidence of cost effectiveness for the sleep and the combination intervention. So I should have said before that when you look at an ISA, a lower ISA is better because you're getting more outcomes for the same dollar. But anyway, a lower ISA is better. And what you can see there is that the sleep intervention was 74% cost effective, and the combination was only 23% cost effective. We've moved on from the EPOC model. My colleague Anna Killida in her PhD actually worked on a model that took into account socioeconomic position of children. And it's called the EPOC model because it can also look at equity-informed economic evaluation. So this is taken into account even if children start at a particular BMI at age 5, the lower SCP children will take a higher trajectory and the higher SCP children will take a lower trajectory. And this means that you can actually evaluate interventions stratified by different socioeconomic groups. And given the strong socioeconomic patterning of child obesity, this is a real advance in our methodologies. Just want to talk quickly about a lot of our work involved doing a very deep dive into the LSAT data. And so this was a study that really informed the modeling, but what it actually found was that inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities develop in middle childhood. What you can see here in these graphs is BMI growth, in other words, like a rate of BMI growth per annum, for early childhood, so that's actually from like 2 up until 5, middle childhood from 5 up until about 10, and adolescence from 10 or 11 to 17, I think. And so, and the bottom axis there is SCP quintile. So a quintile of 1 is the lowest quintile or highest disadvantage. Quintile 5 is lowest disadvantage. So you can see that in early childhood, it's flat, so there's no inequality in BMI growth. Also notable that it's negative because you're just going into that kind of nadir for the BMI curve, if anybody is familiar with that. In middle childhood, you can see there's a very strong slope so that the children in the lowest quintile are gaining much more weight per annum than children in the highest quintile or the least socioeconomic disadvantage. In adolescence, there is still a bit of a slope, but it's probably not so pronounced as in middle childhood. So with this new model, we were able to look at cost effectiveness by socioeconomic position. And again, we were using the POISE sleep arm, stratified our analysis by low, middle and high socioeconomic position. And in fact, all of these cost effectiveness ratios would be deemed cost effective, but it was most cost effective in the middle and the lowest socioeconomic groups, which is actually great news because it means that you know, you could target this intervention, you would expect it to be very cost effective, you also wouldn't have to kind of trade off that sort of equity efficiency. You wouldn't have to have any trades off between equity and efficiency. Okay, so the implications of this work is that we've actually got the tools to evaluate any intervention where there is a BMI change. And although I didn't actually elucidate this, we can actually evaluate interventions at any age during childhood because of the way the model works. We started by only modelling to age 15. That was because of the limitations of the waves of data we had available to us. We can now model right up to age 18, and we could also, because we joined this model up with an adult model, we do have the potential to model over a lifetime horizon, should that be desired. We can look at cost effectiveness evidence in terms of cost per QALY and cost per unit BMI avoided. And the EQ-EPOC model can look at cost effectiveness for different socioeconomic groups, can look at equity impacts, and can predict whether inequalities will widen or narrow as a result of an intervention. Before I finish, I just want to talk about a couple of important findings from LSAC. As I said, we've done a deep dive into this data set. So in our model, you remember we used the utility values from a systematic review. In another study I'm involved with, the TORCH study, we have been looking at quality of life, which is this measure of quality of life, the PEDSQL, the Pediatric Quality of Life Inventory, is probably the most widely used quality of life instrument in children. Sadly, you cannot get a utility score from it at the moment, but my colleagues at TORCH will probably change all that because that's what they're working on right now. But if you look at this graph, you can see that based on the PEDSQL, the children in healthy weight have they kind of maintain their quality of life during childhood. Children with overweight, it declines slightly, and children with obesity declines quite substantially during childhood. So this obviously, early childhood intervention offers potential to avoid this loss of quality of life. And on the modelling side, hopefully we'll be able to be a bit more sophisticated in the future with our modelling by having age-specific utilities. Another study that also did another deep dive was looking at tracking of weight status. And basically what we found was healthy weight has very, very strong tracking. So what I mean is if you are at a healthy weight at age 3, it's a very, very strong probability you'll be at a healthy weight at age 4 and age 5. On the other hand, unhealthy weight, although it tracks strongly above 7 years, under 7 years, it did not track so strongly, which means that there's a lot of possibility for children under 7 years to revert to a healthy weight range. The other major finding in this study was that low socioeconomic status and socioeconomic position and measures of cultural diversity are independent risk factors for moving into overweight during childhood. And this leads me to the current gaps and future plans. So we're currently trying to extend the EPOC model for children from high-risk culturally and linguistically diverse groups. We're also developing a model for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, which is based on the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. And that's my acknowledgements. Thank you very much for listening.
Again, thank you so much, Alison, for bringing this information and putting many years of work into a short presentation for us all. We have some time for questions from the audience here, and I was wondering if we could just go here. So please put up your hands if you want to ask a question. Yes, Peter Sestouli. Oh, we need a microphone. Yeah, we'll do that. But Peter, might need somebody to help with it.
Thanks to Louise and the whole team. That was a terrific presentation, such an important body of work. And it's incredibly timely, at least in the Australian context, because the Australian government is increasingly recognising the importance of sleep. Pre-COVID, they ran a parliamentary inquiry into sleep health awareness, and a range of recommendations came out, the first of which is that sleep should be recognised as a national health priority alongside nutrition and physical activity. The government just earlier this year responded to that inquiry in very, very positive terms, which is encouraging. And I've recently been part of an expert working party that's put together an policy evidence briefing document for government to take note of, and there's a nice piece on children in there as well. So thanks for all the great work you're doing. My question, which is probably directed to Rachel, is that there's an obvious focus on sleep duration here, and that aligns nicely with the literature that exists. But a more nuanced perspective of sleep health incorporates other domains of sleep quality and sleep consistency, and the latter made up of both the timing of sleep, but the regularity from night to night and from weekdays to weekends being shown to be independently important beyond sleep duration. So I just wondered whether you're starting to incorporate some of these other metrics in your analyses.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that. And it's great to hear what Aussie are up to in that sleep space. Yes, absolutely. So in terms of particularly the bed study where we're looking at screens and sleep, we'll be looking at all those quality measures as well as sleep duration. So that's really good to see. Totally agree that the emphasis has very much been on duration. And I think that's from a simplistic point of view, because duration is much easier to measure, whereas sleep quality is more variable, more complicated. There are lots of different ways of measuring it and so on. But yeah, all of our studies, I mean, POI we didn't, because the intervention and DREAM, the sort of mechanistic one, because it wasn't about that, because the evidence in relation to weight at least is stronger for duration at this point. So that was what we were focusing on. If we were trying to improve sleep quality, we might have done something different. But yeah, we're relevant. We absolutely are looking at all aspects of sleep.
Thank you.
I'm really interested, Alison, in please put up your hands if you've got questions, people, because this is a really incredible areas of work. Alison, you've done cost effectiveness. How do you go from doing the cost effectiveness analysis of POI in this example, and you've done some others, how is that then used to advocate for interventions and so on? How would you use that information?
I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that the cost effectiveness of a trial or an RCT delivered in that kind of setting is quite different to the cost effectiveness of something that is implemented. I mean, implementation is messy, and so I guess it's like a first line of evidence from the cost effectiveness of an RCT. You can, I mean, with the modelling, you could, and we haven't done a lot of this yet, but you could actually try and look at the cost effectiveness of an implemented intervention. And in order to do that, you would look at the number of people who would receive the intervention, the projected benefits. Now, a lot of people, people say that you lose half of the effectiveness when you actually roll something out. So I think, you know, we haven't actually done that, but potentially you could look at, you know, the cost effectiveness in an implemented way. And the other things you want to look at is things like the total budget required, because the total cost obviously is another important thing. Yeah, and perhaps budget impact. So, you know, how much money would have to be spent year on year. So, yeah, it's another whole area of work.
Rachel, if you were in charge of the New Zealand or the Australian budget and decisions around obesity prevention or issues like that, where would you put your focus? Or do you think, is that a silly question?
No, not a silly question. I mean, are any of your questions silly, Louise? But where would I put my money? I think we need some of the, in terms of obesity, we need some of the bigger government stuff. We need government to step up and do some of the environmental stuff if we're really going to make an impact on childhood obesity in terms of the food advertising and some of those more upstream effects on that. But I do think there is real potential, which sounds like what Aussie has done, in terms of just people being a bit more aware of sleep and the importance of sleep. And yet it shouldn't be that hard. I mean, we all know that if you sleep well, or if your child sleep well, life is actually pretty easy to manage all the other things that fall out of it. You know, it's such a critical component of our health and well-being that's really fairly underrated, really. We tend to prioritise a lot of other things over our sleep. And I think we'd be a lot better off if we managed to do that. So anything that the government budget-wise could do to promote better sleep for all ages, but including our children and adolescents, I think would make a real difference to health.
What about you, Alison? Thank you, Rachel. What about you, Alison? Where would you think? Or
look, I mean, when I think of all the work that we have done with different interventions, I'm sold on the sleep. Definitely sold on the sleep.
That's fantastic. Actually, there's a question in the back that was that a question? Yeah. We'll have one quick question and then we'll need to finish. I might just add that Rachel and myself and Steve Simpson will all in a few weeks' time be in jet lagged in Denmark talking about the prevention of obesity in childhood. So we'll be able to explore this a little bit more, Rachel. But yes, a question from the back.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the interesting presentations. I'm Pip from Clinical Trials. I'm a research portfolio. I was just interested in how we tease out the sort of confounding factors that we have related to socioeconomic position. You know, if you're an overweight adult, you're more likely to have overweight children. You're also more likely to have poor sleep, hygiene, etc. So I think we've got this sort of intergenerational factor on top of just those interventions that we can do. So it's going to have to be sort of multi-generational in a way.
Anyone wants to comment?
I mean, Alison, but well, Rachel, you go.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, absolutely agree. I didn't present it today, but we have done another trial called Moi Moia, which was a kaupapa Māori-led one. So where, because of course most of our sleep guidelines really don't fit the lived realities of many people for many of the things that you've actually mentioned, including for our Māori and Pacifica populations in New Zealand. And so basically we totally ignored the Western literature. We went back to the traditional knowledge and have developed an intervention that's very much based, whose kaupapa or method is sort of based on connectedness, whānau, so wider family, not just an individual, which tends to be what our Western interventions are, and have looked at wellbeing and sleep and outcomes. And what intrigues me from a Pākehā or a European point of view is that although we started from a sort of totally different place, we've ended up in quite a similar place. So a lot of the interventions that have been developed through this Māori kaupapa bear a strong resemblance to what's in the Western literature as well, but with some fundamental differences. So, for instance, Western science would tell you that you need to put your child to bed regularly and at a certain time of the day. Māori stuff uses ritual rather than routine. So it still has the same behaviours, if you like, but it's not tied to time. Whether that has an impact on weight and things remains to be seen from our analyses, but it's certainly an approach that's more strengths-based, it's more focused on traditional values and all sorts of things like that. So I think it's not necessarily a matter of adapting what we do, we need to sometimes think totally differently.
Thank you, Rachel. Would you like to make it?
The only point I was going to make is completely agree that determinants of childhood obesity are complex. In our modelling, we have to be somewhat pragmatic because we are never going to get information from, say, a trial that includes things, but actually it's very unusual for people to even measure socioeconomic position. So whether that's education, income, but we're never going to get information on mothers' BMI. It's extremely unlikely. So, you know, we realise that our modelling is simplified, but, you know, in a way, these are really tools to be able to push the case for investment in particular interventions.
Okay, folk, we've had a real treat just now, hearing two really amazing people at the top of their game, one in New Zealand and one here at the University of Sydney, talking about their work. It's quite amazing to think about. I mean, as Rachel has done her work over many years, I've been amazed to see how the issue of sleep has become more and more pronounced. We're both really interested in obesity and body composition and nutrition and so on, but the issue of sleep has really been highlighted by Rachel's work. And with Alison, we've seen someone who's asked really interesting questions about cost effectiveness, about utility, about quality of life, and used a range of tools and worked collaboratively with people to give us information that can help us make important decisions and help us think about what is actually happening. Both Rachel and Alison have done work that's highlighted the role of equity in the response to the world in which we live and people's risks for obesity and other health issues. Their work is tremendous. I really value working with them in our Centre of Research Excellence, but I know they do far broader work. I just want to encourage those people here, if any of you want to come and be part of it, if any weren't sold on collaborative work and working with a diverse group of people, I'm hoping that you're getting that sense from hearing Rachel and Alison talk. Of course, this is also part of the ethos of the Charles Perkins Centre. I want to thank both Rachel and Alison for their incredible work, and I think you can see that we're used to each other. We've actually done work together and we get on, which is a really lovely other aspect of this whole thing. As we finish, I just want to let you people know that this is the final Charles Perkins Centre talk for 2023, and we will resume Charles Perkins Centre talks in March next year, and details will be circulated close to that time. But thank you all for joining us, and particularly to Alison, who's interestingly, even though she's supposed to be in New Zealand, Rachel, she's just under an hour ahead of us, which is really interesting. I don't know, but the clock behind you hasn't been turned.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I forgot about that.
I thought you were just playing the pound money.
No, that's laziness to change the daylight saving.
Well, thank you, Rachel, Alison, and everybody.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. See you, everyone.
Thank you. They're really very